My name is Elise Morrow, and I am 41 years old. On a Tuesday morning in March, I was at my desk reviewing month-end reports when a man named Daniel Reyes from my bank's fraud department called my office line and asked if I had a moment. He asked me to verify my identity. He asked me to confirm my social security number, my address, and the last four of my driver's license. Then he asked me whether I had recently submitted a business loan application for $400,000. I had not. He said the application had been flagged through their secondary review process. Everything in it was technically in order. My signature appeared on every page. My tax returns were attached. My income was correctly stated. The collateral was listed as the equity in our home. The application had passed initial review and was 3 days from funding before something small caught his eye and he pulled the file. I asked him what had caught his eye. He said the signature on the application was identical, character by character, to the signature on a check from my husband's checkbook that had been deposited at our branch 6 weeks earlier. Bank fraud investigators look at signatures for a living. They know that no two genuine signatures by the same person are ever truly identical. Mine on those two documents were. He asked me if I would like to come into the bank that afternoon. I said I would. I want you to know what I did before I drove to that bank. I closed my office door. I sat at my desk for a few minutes. I did not cry. I did not call my husband. I did not call anyone. I opened my work laptop and I logged into the joint accounts I had been managing for the entire 11 years of our marriage, and I started reading the statements with a different kind of attention than I had ever read them with before. This is how it happened. Wherever you are right now, drop your location and the time in the comments. I genuinely want to know. To understand what my husband did, you have to understand what kind of life we had built and what kind of person I was inside it. I am an accountant. I have been since I was 23. I work as a controller for a mid-size manufacturing company, which is the kind of job people do not understand the importance of until they meet someone who does it well. The controller is the person who makes sure every dollar that moves through a company moves through it the way it is supposed to move. The person who knows where everything is. The person who notices when a number that should be one thing is actually slightly something else. I am good at my job. I have been good at it for a long time, and I have been good at it because the same thing that makes me a good controller has always made me me, which is that I cannot leave a number alone if it is not where it is supposed to be. I cannot walk away from a discrepancy. I cannot stop thinking about a column that does not add up. People who do my work either have this trait or they do not, and the ones who do not eventually find other work. This trait, this constitutional inability to ignore a financial inconsistency, is the reason I had been managing the household finances for the entire 11 years of my marriage. It was not a decision we had made formally. It was just what happened when two people moved in together, and one of them was a controller. The bills got paid because I paid them. The accounts got reconciled because I reconciled them. The taxes got filed correctly because I filed them. My husband, Dean, did not push back on this arrangement because it suited him, and I did not push back on it because it suited me. I liked knowing where the money was. He liked not having to think about it. I will tell you about Dean now. I will try to be fair to him because the version of him that I lived with for 11 years was mostly a decent man. He worked in middle management at a logistics company. He was steady, present, not particularly ambitious, but not lazy either. He came home at 6. He was reasonable. He remembered birthdays. He was, by most reasonable measures, the kind of husband most women would say they were lucky to have. He was also, I would come to understand, the kind of man whose decency held only as long as nothing was asked of it. As long as life ran smoothly, Dean was a good husband. The question of what Dean would be when life did not run smoothly was a question I had not had to answer for 11 years. I should have asked it earlier. Because Dean had a family, and Dean's family had a problem, and Dean's family's problem had a name. It was called Morrow's, and it was a restaurant. Dean's younger brother Trevor had opened Morrow's 8 years before any of this. Italian-American casual, the kind of place with a brick wall and Edison bulbs, and a menu of pasta and pizza that was fine but not memorable. Trevor was 32 when he opened it, with no restaurant experience, no business education, and a great deal of confidence. The capital came from his parents and from Dean and from me indirectly, because Dean had asked me very early in our marriage if I would be okay with him contributing $20,000 to help his brother get started. I had been okay with it because I had loved Dean, and $20,000 was a one-time investment and family was family. The restaurant did not fail in the dramatic way restaurants fail. It failed in the slow, attritional way certain restaurants fail, which is to say it never quite made money but also never quite died. It limped along year after year, taking in just enough to pay the staff and the rent, requiring just enough additional capital each year to plug the gaps. The Morrow family had become, over 8 years, a steady supplier of plug capital to Morrows. I knew some of this and not all of it. I knew that Dean's parents had given Trevor money periodically. I knew that Dean had given Trevor money periodically because Dean had asked me about it the first few times, and I had said yes the first few times. After the third or fourth time, I had said gently that the gifts to Trevor needed to be discussed jointly because they were significant, and Dean had agreed, and I had thought the matter resolved. I knew that the family dynamic around Trevor was that he was the dreamer, the artist, the brother with the vision, and that whatever you thought of his vision, the family had collectively decided to support it. I did not know, until that Tuesday afternoon at the bank, the actual scale of the support. I did not know that Dean had been moving money to Trevor regularly for the last 18 months without my knowledge. I did not know that the modest checking account I had stopped paying close attention to because it was a low-balance operational account had been receiving and dispersing tens of thousands of dollars in transfers I had not authorized. I did not know that my husband had been quietly funding his brother's failing restaurant out of our marriage for the better part of 2 years. And I certainly did not know that he had, 6 weeks ago, sat down at our kitchen table and forged my signature on a $400,000 loan application designed to save the restaurant once and for all. Daniel Reyes met me at the bank that Tuesday afternoon. He was in his 50s, careful, the kind of man who had built a career on noticing things other people had decided not to look at. He took me into a small conference room and opened a folder on the table between us. The loan application. 23 pages. My name on the cover. My social security number, my date of birth, my employer information, my income figures from my most recent W-2. And my signature, page after page, on every required line, in a hand that was, as he had said on the phone, identical to itself across multiple pages, which is the one thing a real signature never is. He walked me through it methodically. He showed me the comparison to my actual signature, which they had on file from various account documents I had opened with the bank over the years. He showed me the differences, the natural variations in my actual signature that proved it was mine, and the eerily consistent reproduction of those variations on the loan application that proved the application's signature was not. He showed me the application's listed collateral, which was the equity in our home, the home that was held in both our names jointly. He showed me the application's stated purpose for the loan, which was business expansion for a restaurant called Morrow's, of which the applicant, me, was listed as a co-investor seeking to support a family business. I asked him who had submitted the application. He said it had been submitted in person at a branch across town 6 weeks ago by my husband, who had provided photocopies of my identification along with the signed documents. The branch employee who had processed the intake had not flagged anything. Why would they? Husbands and wives applied for loans together all the time. Sometimes one spouse handled the paperwork. Nothing about the submission itself had been unusual. The thing that had stopped the loan 3 days from funding was Daniel Reyes himself, who had been reviewing flagged applications for 14 years and who had noticed in the routine secondary review that my signature was too perfect. He had pulled additional documents. He had compared. He had confirmed his suspicion. He had called me before he called my husband, because his protocol when forgery was suspected was to verify with the person whose identity had allegedly been used before involving the alleged forger. He asked me what I wanted to do. He explained my options carefully. I could decline to proceed with the loan, which would simply stop it from funding and leave no further consequence to anyone. I could file a formal fraud report, which would trigger a federal investigation because bank fraud and identity theft cross federal lines, and which would carry serious consequences for whoever had signed my name. He told me I did not have to decide that afternoon. I had 48 hours. I told him I would let him know within 24. I drove home, but I did not go home. I drove to the office of a divorce attorney I had been referred to once by a colleague 3 years earlier, in a context that had nothing to do with my own marriage and whose card I had kept in a drawer, because that is the kind of thing a controller does. Her name was Patricia Levin. She was in her 60s, sharp, with the bearing of a woman who had seen every variation of every story and was past being surprised by any of them. I had called her from my car. She had agreed to see me at 6 that evening after her last scheduled meeting. I sat in her office at 6 and I laid out what I knew: the phone call, the loan application, the forged signature, the likely months of unauthorized financial activity I had not yet had a chance to audit. She listened without interrupting. When I was finished, she said 2 things. The first thing she said was that I had a 48-hour window to decide whether to press federal charges, and that whatever I decided to do about my marriage, the question of the criminal charges was separate and needed to be answered first. Bank fraud and identity theft were not minor offenses. The penalties were significant. Pressing charges would have consequences for Dean that would extend beyond our marriage into his employment, his future financial life, and potentially his physical freedom for some period of time. I needed to be honest with myself, she said, about whether I wanted that. The second thing she said was that before I made any decision about anything, I needed to know the full picture of what Dean had done. 48 hours, she said, was enough time to audit. 48 hours, she said, was a gift. Most women in my situation did not get 48 hours. She told me what to pull: the joint checking, the joint savings, the credit cards in both names, any account I had access to, including ones I had stopped looking at. She told me to print every statement from the past 2 years. She told me to come back the next afternoon with whatever I had found. I drove home. Dean was already there. He was making dinner. He kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day had been. I said it had been fine. I went into my home office, closed the door, and started pulling statements. If you have ever discovered something while smiling at the dinner table, drop a comment. I want to know how many of us there are. Here is what I found in the 11 hours between dinner and dawn. I found that Dean had moved $63,000 from our joint accounts into Trevor's restaurant operating account over the past 18 months, in payments small enough that none of them individually had triggered the kind of review I would have done on a larger transfer. I found that he had done this primarily through our smaller operational checking account, the one I had stopped reconciling line by line because I had reconciled it line by line for 9 years, and nothing had ever been wrong with it, and I had finally extended my husband the trust of letting one account go unaudited. I found that he had used the credit cards in both our names to pay for several restaurant expenses directly: food suppliers, kitchen equipment repairs, a payroll service for a quarter, charges that had been buried among other charges and that I had glanced at and dismissed because the amounts had been moderate and I had been busy, and Dean was my husband. I want to tell you what it felt like to find each of those transfers. The first one I found, I assumed I was misreading the statement. A $6,000 transfer from the operational checking to an account I did not recognize, dated almost a year and a half ago. I checked it twice. I pulled up the account history. I traced the transfer's reference number. It was clear and clean. The transfer had happened. I had not authorized it. I had not even seen it. Dean had moved it during a week when I had been traveling for work, when I was unlikely to be checking statements casually. That was the first one. After that, I found another, and another. They were not regular. Dean had been careful. They occurred at intervals that suggested he had been waiting for the right moments, weeks when I was particularly busy at the office or out of town, or otherwise unlikely to be paying close attention to a low-balance operational account. Some months had no transfers. Some months had 2. The pattern was the pattern of someone who knew he was hiding something, and who had built his hiding around the rhythms of the person he was hiding it from. He had used my predictability against me. He had paid attention to my schedule precisely enough to know when I would not be watching. That detail bothered me more than the money. The money was bad. The money was real and substantial, and represented a betrayal of agreements we had made about what we did with shared funds. But the planning was worse. The planning meant he had been thinking about me, the wife sitting across from him at dinner, as a problem to be solved, rather than a partner to be trusted. He had been studying me to determine how to circumvent me, for 18 months, while telling me he loved me. I found that the timing of the transfers correlated with what I assumed must have been crises at the restaurant, payment deadlines Trevor could not meet, vendor demands, payroll shortfalls. Dean had been plugging the holes, repeatedly, for a year and a half, with our money, without telling me. And alongside the transfers, I found the credit card charges, which had a different texture entirely. Those were impulsive: a repair, a delivery, a service, charged to cards in our joint names and absorbed into monthly statements that ran a few $1,000s one way or another in any given month. I had never thought to scrutinize the individual charges, because the monthly totals had stayed within the normal band. Dean had counted on this. He had counted on my own efficiency at managing the household finances at a high level, rather than auditing every individual transaction the way I audited transactions at work. The most painful thing I found was a credit card statement from 14 months earlier showing a charge of $4,200 to a kitchen equipment company. I remembered that month. I remembered glancing at the statement and feeling a small flicker of concern about the total, and asking Dean about it casually one evening, and Dean telling me that he had needed to replace some things on the work truck he occasionally used for side projects, and would I please trust him on this one because it was complicated. I had trusted him on that one. I had taken his word. I had filed the statement and moved on. 14 months later, looking at the same statement, I knew exactly what that $4,200 had bought. Replacement equipment for Trevor's kitchen, the walk-in cooler that had gone out the previous spring. I had paid for it without knowing I was paying for it, because my husband had asked me to trust him, and I had. And I found, in our home filing cabinet, a folder I had not seen before, labeled M-Loan Docs in Dean's handwriting. Inside the folder were copies of everything Daniel Reyes had shown me at the bank. My personal financial documents, my W-2s, my tax returns, copies of my driver's license, bank statements for accounts in my name, everything an applicant would need to apply for a loan as me. Dean had organized it carefully. There were notes in the margins in his handwriting. There was a printed email chain with someone who appeared to be a representative for the lender, in which Dean had been corresponding with the lender as me, using my name and my email address, which he had access to because we had set it up together years ago using a password we both knew. I want you to imagine for a moment the email chain. The lender writing to me, calling me by my first name, asking me to confirm certain figures or to provide additional documentation. Dean responding as me, in language designed to sound like me, signing the emails with my name. He had impersonated me to a stranger, in writing, for weeks, to accomplish an act of identity theft that would have placed our home at risk. And while he was doing this, he had been coming home, eating dinner with me, kissing me before bed, and asking how my day had been. The folder also contained in the back a spiral notebook in which Dean had been keeping notes for himself about the restaurant, about what it would take to save it, about projections he had clearly produced himself, which forecasted that with one major capital infusion, $400,000 to clear existing debts and reposition the business, Trevor would be able to turn the restaurant around within 12 months, and that Dean would be able to begin repaying the loan within 18. I read through the notebook carefully. The projections were not absurd on their face. Dean had clearly spent time on them. But they were also, in the particular way that motivated projections are, optimistic to the point of fantasy. He had assumed a 30% increase in average revenue per cover within the first 6 months of the rebranding he and Trevor had planned. He had assumed a corresponding reduction in food costs because of a new vendor relationship that had not yet been confirmed. He had assumed sustained year-over-year growth that would have outperformed every comparable restaurant in the area. He had built a financial castle on assumptions a careful lender would have laughed at, and then he had constructed a fraudulent loan application to support it. There was no version of this notebook in which I existed as a person who needed to be consulted. I was, in the notebook, a resource, a signature, a credit score, a balance sheet attached to a life. The plan had never required my agreement. It had only required my information, which Dean had access to because we were married, and my signature, which Dean had practiced enough times to reproduce identically across 23 pages of a federal loan application. I sat at my desk at 3 a.m. with the folder open in front of me, and I understood several things at once. I understood that what Dean had done was not impulsive. It was planned. He had gathered documents over weeks. He had practiced a signature. He had written projections. He had executed a strategy that depended entirely on my not finding out, because he had calculated correctly that if I had found out before the loan funded, I would have stopped it, and incorrectly, that if I had found out after the loan funded, I would have accepted it as a fait accompli because the money would already be at the restaurant and the alternative would be ruining his brother's business and his family's reputation. He had bet on my conflict aversion. He had bet on my desire to keep the family together. He had bet on his ability to manage me afterward by framing what he had done as love. He had bet wrong. He had bet wrong because he had spent 11 years married to a controller and had not understood fundamentally what that meant about who I was. He had thought my carefulness was a personality trait, like being tidy. He had not understood that my carefulness was an ethic, that the reason I balanced our accounts to the penny was the same reason I would, when forced to choose, balance everything else. I closed the folder. I went to bed. I slept for 2 hours. I got up, I made breakfast. I kissed Dean goodbye when he left for work, and I told him I loved him, because saying anything else at that moment would have changed his behavior, and I needed his behavior to remain unchanged for another 12 hours. Then I called Daniel Reyes from my car on the way to the office, and I told him I wanted to file the fraud report. He said he understood. He said he would begin the formal process that morning. He said it would take a few weeks for the federal investigation to fully unfold, and that during that time I should expect to be interviewed by federal agents, and that my husband would be contacted by investigators, likely at his place of employment, likely within 10 business days. I asked Daniel whether there was a way to know which day, approximately. He paused. He said he could not commit to a specific date, but that he would let me know once he had a sense of timing. I told him I would appreciate that. I had filing to do. The next 10 business days I spent doing what I had been trained for. I worked at my job, and I worked at the larger job of unwinding a marriage I had not yet told my husband was over. I met with Patricia Levin twice more. I gathered every document she asked for. I quietly transferred the contents of accounts that had been jointly held, but were sole signatory on my side, which is to say accounts where I had the legal authority to move money without his signature, into accounts in my name only. I did not steal anything. I simply moved my own money out of harm's way before harm arrived. I documented every transfer with the same precision I documented everything else, because the last thing I wanted when this got to a courtroom was to be the one who had cut corners. I learned in those 10 days things about my own marriage I had been too trusting to notice. I learned that Dean had been telling his family that he and I were both fully behind the restaurant rescue. I learned this through a casual remark his mother made when she called the house on a Saturday morning, and Dean was at the gym, in which she thanked me for being so supportive of Trevor and asked if I had seen the projections. I had said yes, I had seen them, and I had not corrected her, because Dean's mother did not yet need to know what her son had done. She would find out soon enough. I learned that Trevor had been operating for months on the assumption that the loan was coming. He had been making promises to vendors based on it. He had told his staff that there was good news on the horizon. He had been, in effect, running a business on credit he expected to receive on the strength of a fraudulent application. He probably did not know was fraudulent, but had certainly not asked questions about. I learned that my home, the home Dean and I had bought together 6 years into our marriage, had been listed on the loan application as collateral, which meant that if the loan had funded and if the restaurant had failed, the bank would have come for our home. Dean had risked our home, the equity I had contributed the majority of from my pre-marriage savings, on the chance that he could save his brother's failing restaurant. He had risked it without asking me. He had risked it knowing I would say no if he asked. Federal agents came to Dean's office on the 12th business day after I had filed the report. I know this because Daniel had given me a heads up the day before. I had taken the morning off from work and I had been at home, organizing the documents Patricia would need for the divorce filing, when Dean called me from his car in the parking lot of his office building. His voice was unfamiliar. He said something had happened. He said he needed to come home. He said he could not say more on the phone. I said, okay. I told him I would be there. I made coffee. I waited. When he came in, he looked smaller than he had ever looked. He told me what had happened. 2 FBI agents had come to his office. They had asked to speak to him in a conference room. They had asked him about a loan application bearing my signature. They had read him his rights. They had not arrested him, not yet, but they had made it clear that an arrest was possible, and they had made it clear that the matter was very serious. He had been escorted from the building by his employer's HR director 10 minutes after the agents left. He had been told not to return until further notice. He sat at our kitchen table, the table I had been audited from in a sense for 18 months, and he looked at me and he said, "Elise." "They said the report came from you." I said, "Yes." He said, "But how did you know?" I said, "The bank called me." I said, "They called me before they called you." I said I had known for almost 2 weeks. His face went through several things. Shock first, then a kind of pleading, then anger, then a recalculation as he understood slowly that I had been moving alongside him in our home for the better part of 2 weeks, with full knowledge of what he had done, and that I had not confronted him, and that I had not warned him, and that I had instead gathered evidence and built a position and waited for the federal investigation to begin. He asked me why. I told him that what he had done was not a mistake. It was a plan. He had gathered my documents, practiced my signature, written projections, corresponded with a lender as me, listed our home as collateral, and submitted a fraudulent application for $400,000. He had done all of this without my knowledge because he had calculated correctly that I would have stopped him. He had treated my identity as a resource the same way his family had treated him as a resource for his brother. And he had assumed, the way certain men assume, that he would be able to manage me into accepting it after the fact, because he had spent 11 years married to a woman whose carefulness he had mistaken for compliance. I told him I was not compliant. I told him I had filed the fraud report. I told him I had filed for divorce that morning, papers to be served at the appropriate moment. I told him I had moved my accounts. I told him I had retained an attorney. I told him I had done all of this in the past 2 weeks while he ate dinner across from me and kissed me on the cheek before bed. I told him that what he had done to me was not a moment of bad judgment. It was an indictment of who he had decided I was inside our marriage. He had decided I was an instrument. I was not. I was a person. And the person I was, the person he had married 11 years earlier, had certain values about what people did to other people and certain training in how to recognize when those values had been violated, and the appropriate response when those values had been violated was not to forgive quietly and move on. It was to use every legitimate mechanism the law made available to make sure the violation had a consequence proportional to itself. He cried. I let him cry. I did not console him. I sat across from him and I waited. The federal investigation proceeded. Dean was charged with bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. The aggravated identity theft charge carried a mandatory 2-year minimum sentence, which Patricia had explained to me in detail and which I had understood when I filed the report. The bank fraud charge carried potential additional time depending on the judge and the circumstances. Dean's attorney negotiated. There was no version in which Dean did not serve time, because the federal sentencing guidelines for the offenses he had committed did not allow for one. The plea agreement ultimately was for 30 months. He is currently incarcerated at a federal facility about 2 hours from our former home. He will be eligible for early release after 26 months if his behavior is good. I attended the sentencing hearing because I had been advised by the prosecutor to do so. Victim impact, I was told, was something the federal courts took seriously. I had written a statement. I had revised it 3 times. On the morning of the hearing, I sat in the courtroom in a navy blue suit and watched my husband sit beside his attorney in a different suit, one I had bought him years ago for a wedding we had attended together. He had lost weight. His hair was different. He looked smaller than I remembered him. When it was my turn to speak, I went to the lectern and I read what I had written. I had been careful with it. I had not written a speech about my own pain, because the federal court was not interested in my pain in any sentimental sense. The federal court was interested in the impact of the crime on me as a person, and the impact of the crime on me as a person was specific and quantifiable. I had spent 10 weeks of my professional time disentangling fraudulent activity in my own accounts. I had paid an attorney significant fees to file for divorce. I had reorganized my entire financial life to protect my credit, which had been at risk for months. I had been required as a victim to participate in an investigation, attend interviews, provide statements, and absorb the secondary consequences of a federal criminal prosecution that I had not asked to be part of. I had lost a husband, which I described in one sentence and did not dwell on. I had lost trust, in a specific and useful way, in a man I had known for 13 years. I read the statement. I did not look at Dean while I read it. When I finished, I went back to my seat. Dean's attorney made a brief argument for leniency. The prosecutor made a brief argument against it. The judge, an older woman who had presided over many such cases, asked Dean whether he had anything to say. Dean stood up. He said he was sorry. He said he had not understood what he was doing at the time. He said he had been desperate to save his brother. He looked across at me when he said it. I looked back at him without expression, because the federal court was not a place for expressions, and because I had nothing to give him in that moment. The judge sentenced him to 30 months and remanded him to custody. He was led from the courtroom by a federal marshal. I watched him go. I did not cry. I sat for another moment after the courtroom had begun to empty out, and then I gathered my things and I walked out into the corridor and I went home and I made dinner and I went to bed at the usual time. The bank, having identified the fraud, rescinded the loan application. The restaurant did not receive the $400,000. Trevor, who had been operating his business on the assumption that the funding was coming, did not have the cash flow to continue without it. The restaurant closed 8 weeks after Dean's arrest. Trevor lost the lease. The remaining staff were laid off. Trevor moved in with his and Dean's parents at the age of 40, which I understand has been an adjustment for everyone involved. In the weeks after Dean's arrest, before the restaurant closed, I had received several phone calls from various members of Dean's family. Some of them were angry, some of them were confused. Some of them were the kind of plea I had been bracing for, which was the suggestion that perhaps I could withdraw the report, perhaps there was a way to make this go away, perhaps I had not thought through what I was doing. I had listened to all of them, and I had said the same thing each time. The fraud report was filed. The investigation was federal. I had no ability to withdraw it even if I had wanted to, and I did not want to. The decision had been made. The decision was the right decision. I would not be entertaining further conversations on the topic. I want to tell you about the call from Trevor specifically. He called me from his restaurant a week after Dean's arrest. He was crying, which I did not hold against him because his life was falling apart in real time. He told me he had not known about the forgery. He had only known that Dean was working on getting capital. He had not asked questions about the source of the capital because he had not wanted to know. I believed him. I told him I believed him. I also told him that not asking questions about a source of capital that was about to materialize at $400,000 from a brother who did not have $400,000 was, in itself, a moral failure, and that he was old enough to know better. He started crying harder. I told him I had to go. I hung up. I do not regret that conversation. Trevor had been a passive beneficiary of the entire arrangement. He had benefited for 18 months from money Dean had moved without my knowledge. He had benefited from the loan he had not yet received. He had never once, in those 18 months, asked his brother how the family was managing it. He had simply taken what was offered and stayed silent about where it came from. He was not as culpable as Dean, but he was not blameless either. Pretending he had been blameless would have been my own kind of moral failure, and I was not interested in that one either. Dean's parents did not take any of this well. His mother called me the day after Dean was arrested and asked me what I had done. I told her, calmly and completely. She did not believe me at first, then she did. Then she became, briefly, very angry with me, in a phone call that lasted 32 minutes, during which she said many things she had been holding for years about how I had never really been part of the family, and how I had been cold, and how a real wife would have understood that family was more important than rules. I let her finish. When she was done, I told her that her son had committed federal crimes against me using my identity and my home as collateral, and that what I had done was decline to absorb those crimes silently, and that if she wanted to call that being cold, she was welcome to call it that, but I was going to call it something else, which was being honest about what had been done to me. She did not call again for a long time. When she eventually did, several months later, the conversation was different. She had begun, I think, to understand. Some people understand only after the consequences have already arrived. Dean's mother was one of those people. The divorce was, as Patricia had predicted, straightforward, because I had been managing the finances and therefore had documentation of every asset and every liability in the marriage. Dean had effectively been living off my organization for 11 years without ever being curious about it. He had assumed the joint accounts he saw were half his by some implicit principle, when in fact the joint accounts had been funded predominantly by my income, which had been substantially higher than his throughout our marriage. The house, which we had bought together, had been purchased with a down payment that came 80% from my pre-marriage savings. The retirement accounts I had been contributing to throughout the marriage were mostly mine because they were tied to my employment. When Patricia laid all of this out for Dean's attorney, the negotiation was short. Dean walked out of the marriage with what he had brought into it, which was a modest retirement account from his previous job, his personal possessions, and a vehicle he had purchased 2 years before we married. He did not get half the house because he had not contributed half the house. He did not get half my retirement because his attorney determined that pursuing it through trial would be unlikely to yield a favorable outcome given Dean's criminal record and the specific nature of what he had done. He left with what he had earned, which was substantially less than he had assumed he was entitled to. He had been living on top of a life I had built, never quite registering that it was mine, until the day the foundation noticed him. It has been almost 2 years since the phone call from Daniel Reyes. I want to tell you about my life now because I think the ending is more important than the middle in stories like this. I kept the house. I had it locked from the inside. Alarm code changed. The locks rekeyed on the day Dean was arraigned, because I had not wanted to come home and find him there. I had it appraised, and I had its title cleaned up so that it was solely mine. I made some changes inside. I bought new furniture for the living room because the old furniture had been chosen jointly, and I did not want to sit on it anymore. I painted my bedroom a color Dean had hated. It is the color I wake up to every morning now. I like it. I am still at the same job. My employer was extraordinarily kind during the period of the investigation, which had required me to provide statements and attend meetings and miss work in ways that would have been difficult to explain without context. I gave them the context briefly, and they responded with the kind of grace that I will not forget. I was promoted last spring. I am now the chief financial officer of my company. The promotion was on the merits, but it would be dishonest to say that the experience of what happened did not also shape something in me that my employer recognized. I had become, in the years of unwinding what Dean had done, even sharper than I had been. I had learned to trust my instincts about money and about people in equal measure. I have not heard directly from Dean in over a year. He wrote me one letter from prison about 6 months in, 3 pages, which I read once. He apologized. He said he had not understood what he was doing at the time. He said he had been desperate to save his brother. He asked me, in the 3rd page, whether there was any possibility when he was released that we might find a way to talk. He said he understood if there was not. He said he would respect whatever I decided. I did not write back. There is nothing to talk about with Dean. The man I married was either always capable of what he did, in which case I did not actually know him, or he became capable of it gradually, in which case I had not been paying close enough attention. Either way, the person across from me at the kitchen table for 11 years had been someone who, when his loyalty to me was tested against his loyalty to his brother, chose his brother and forged my signature on a federal document. I do not need to know which version of him was the truer one. I only need to know that I am not going to put myself in a position to find out. I think a lot about the controller in me, the part that could not leave a number alone if it was not where it was supposed to be. I had spent my whole career honoring that instinct in everyone else's books. I had not, until that Tuesday afternoon at the bank, fully extended it to my own life. I had let one account go unaudited because I had loved my husband and because love seemed like it should be its own reconciliation. It was not. Love is not a reconciliation. Love is a relationship. Reconciliations are reconciliations, and they need to happen on a regular schedule whether you love the person or not, because the absence of a reconciliation is not love, it is just an absence. I reconcile everything now. Personally, the accounts, the relationships, the assumptions I make about people. Once a quarter at minimum, the way I do it at work. I do not consider this paranoia. I consider it the only honest way to live. If you love someone and you trust them, the reconciliation will confirm it. If you love someone and they are not who you thought they were, the reconciliation will reveal it. The reconciliation is not the opposite of love. It is the maintenance of it. The thing love cannot survive without and pretends it can. Dean's brother Trevor reached out to me once, after his restaurant closed and his life rearranged itself, to apologize. I let him apologize. I told him I appreciated it. I did not invite him to coffee. He had not committed the crime. But he had been the beneficiary, knowingly or not, of a scheme that had used me as a resource. And I was not going to extend my hand to the beneficiary just because the beneficiary was sorry. Apologies are free. Restoration costs something. Trevor had not yet offered anything that cost him anything, and I was not going to ask him to. I just was not going to pretend that an apology by itself was a relationship. My life now is quieter than it used to be. I work. I see a small group of friends regularly. I travel sometimes. I read. I sleep through the night now in a way I had not realized I was not sleeping through the night during the marriage. I had thought I was a light sleeper. I had thought it was a personality trait. It was not. I was alert because I had been alert. My body had been doing low-grade vigilance for 11 years, and I had not known it. When the vigilance was no longer necessary, the sleeping arrived. That is the small detail I want you to take from this, if you take any of it. The sleeping. The deep, easy, unmolested sleep that arrives when you remove from your life the person whose presence was making you alert in a way you could not consciously identify. You do not have to know you are not sleeping properly to be not sleeping properly. You just have to be lucky enough eventually to find out. My husband forged my signature on a federal loan application because he had decided that my information was a family resource. He spent 30 months in federal prison because federal courts had decided that no, it was not. Those two understandings cannot occupy the same legal system. Only one of them is the law. He found out which one. It cost him the next 30 months of his life, and the marriage and the brother's business he had been trying to save. The brother's business closed anyway. The brother lost his lease and moved in with his parents, and learned at 40 what most people learn earlier, which is that businesses that survive only through borrowed resources do not actually survive. They die slowly. The kindest thing anyone can do for a person running such a business is to refuse to feed them more borrowed resources, so that the slow death can become a real ending and a real beginning can begin somewhere else. Dean refused to do this for his brother. I refused on Dean's behalf. The brother is selling insurance now, I am told. He is meeting his quotas. I am glad for him. I do not need to know more than that. I keep the deed to my house in a safe in my home office. The safe also contains my passport and my emergency cash, and the original copies of the divorce paperwork, and the federal indictment against Dean. They are not in there because I look at them. They are in there because I want to know exactly where they are, the way a controller wants to know exactly where everything is. That is my story. That's the story. If this found you when you needed it, a like and sub would be nice. I'll see you next time.